Great. Thank you everyone for joining today's virtual session. I'm Lana Graybill. I'm with the City of Boise's Office of Community Engagement. And I will just start us off by sharing what we're doing here today and then kick it off to my colleague, Nikki, who will walk us through the presentation and then kick off some discussions. So to begin, the City of Boise, we are working on some neighborhood conversations to talk with all of you, our residents, about housing affordability and where exactly the pain points are. This session is really focused on hearing from each of you on how housing affordability is impacting you, your loved ones, your neighbors, and friends to help inform how we plan on our side of what resources are needed, what tools do we currently have, and where do we go forward. So with that, I know that we have quite a few people on the call. Our team will do some quick introductions and then Nikki will kick it off. And we have about 45 minutes for the session. So I want to make sure we leave enough time for robust discussion.
Great. I'll get started with my introduction. I'm Kristen Harris. I'm a community engagement coordinator with the City of Boise. Today, I will be helping with our tech side of things. We had a question in the chat, which is a great question about joining with video. Today, our recording here, we are recording this video and it will be posted after for anyone who was not able to make it. Glad you're all here today. But we will only have you share video once we get to the discussion portion. And we will utilize the chat box and potentially the raise hand feature. I'll have Tiffany help us determine how to get you all joining the conversation with us after Nikki gives us a lovely presentation. I will also be taking some notes on this discussion. So anything that you would like omitted or anything you want to make sure gets recorded and taken back for feedback to the rest of our city team, please let me know and I can help you out. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tiffany Mccree. I am the new Energize Our Neighborhood Program Manager. So I will be assisting with the chat box and making sure that all of your questions are recorded in there. Please, during any of the discussion, please make sure those are in there and we'll help navigate that during that discussion.
All right, Nikki, feel free to kick us off with the presentation.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki Olivier Hellenkamp. I work on housing in the mayor's office, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you today and to share just a little bit of information about the things that we're working on, but mostly to hear from you, as Lana said. So Tristan, if you wouldn't mind, open up the slides, that'd be great. Okay, so this is one of a series of neighborhood listening sessions that we're doing both in person and virtually. So there is a calendar of the other events that's available online. If you have folks in your communities who would like to attend any of the other listening sessions that we have going on. And we can go ahead to the next slide. So the idea behind Home for Everyone is a priority around keeping our neighborhoods people-scaled and people-friendly, and knowing that strong neighborhoods need housing at every price point. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about what we mean in terms of price points. If we could go to the next slide. So when it comes to affordable housing, what we are often talking about is housing that is specifically geared toward people who are making a certain income level. And usually what gets used is what's called AMI. It stands for Area Median Income. The median being the middle income that folks in any given area are making. So if you look at the Boise metro area, this is the 2022 data. Area median income is based on household size. So this is assuming a 3-person household, which is the average household size in the Boise metro area. So if you look over here, you'll see that middle income at 100% AMI, that means that is the area median income is $67,400 for that 3-person household. And that you'll see then below that, what's considered moderate income is folks making up to 80% of the area median income. So in our community, that's just under $54,000, and you can see the other numbers there. When we talk about affordable housing, and we talk about area median income, oftentimes it can be hard to put concrete numbers to what we even mean by that. So that's just the goal of the slide here, to try to help us all kind of be on the same page in terms of what we mean. And generally, when we're looking at affordable housing, we're looking at housing that is affordable to people who are making 80% or below of the area median income. So looking at that, about $54,000 a year for a household of 3 and below is generally the folks that we're geared toward. Next slide, please. Okay, so this chart is a little overwhelming to look at at first, but where I would really direct our attention is, let's start over on the left-hand side of the chart. So this is housing that is affordable to folks making 0 to 30% of area median income, so very low income. If you look in that sort of slice of this rainbow, I guess I'll call it, you'll see that about 15% of the population here in Boise falls within that 0 to 30% AMI range. And that although only 15% of the population, they represent 30% of the units that recent housing analysis has found that we need in our city to meet our housing needs. So that comes out to over the next 10 years, a goal of 821 units per year being produced that would serve folks who are in that specific range. If we look over to the next slice of the rainbow, you'll see that the 60%, 31 to 60% AMI is there. That's another 862 units of housing affordable to folks who have an income in that range that are needed, again, per year over the next 10 years. I will say that for units that are affordable to folks making 60% AMI and below, these 2 slices that we've gone over, almost always those units, they are part of what makes them affordable is that they're subsidized, that usually the federal government, sometimes the city government is stepping in with subsidy to make it possible for those units to be built and to operate. It's very challenging for units affordable at that rate to be operated just on the private market, because when you're charging rents that are lower, you're not making as much money as the operator. So once we get up above the 60% AMI, we start to get closer to market rate rents, meaning these are not subsidized units. These are units that are just part of the general housing marketplace. And you can see the slices there as well, that 60 to 80% AMI, we see a need of about 460 units a year over the next 10 years, and then above 80%, a need for about 600 plus units per year for that market rate. So this is a lot of numbers. And I do think that this is a really helpful slide, but also one that sometimes it can take folks a minute to just kind of stare at and see what questions arise. So Tristan, if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to kind of highlight a few things here, and then I think we have some discussion coming up right after this. Maybe we can go back to that slide just to have it in front of us while we're having the discussion, in case that's helpful. So essentially, I mentioned the housing needs analysis that the city had done recently, and what that analysis found was that over the next 10 years, we would need to produce 1,250 units I apologize. what that study found was that there was a huge need for affordable units. And based on the findings, we set an internal goal to produce 1,250 units in the next 5 years that specifically are affordable to households earning 60% of AMI and below. We also set a preservation goal. One thing that I think a lot of people are seeing in our community, and that's happening all over the country, is that units that may be affordable, not in the sense that they are subsidized rent restricted units, but in the sense that they are just units that are cheaper for whatever reason. We're seeing those units be purchased, flipped, and then the rents increased, and the folks who are living there displaced. So this is an area around preservation that the city is also looking at. It's an area we haven't spent a lot of time in the past in. So we're trying to understand some different options around this, but with a goal of preserving 1,000 units of affordable housing again in the next 5 years. And then additionally looking at creating units of supportive housing. So housing that provides also supportive services to the residents is certainly something that we have a lot of need for in our community as well. So that's something that we'll be focused on in terms of our internal goals. And Tristan, if you don't mind popping to the next slide. Great. So as I said, if it would be okay to go back to the big graph slide, just so that if folks have questions about that or questions in general about anything I just said, would love to have a little bit of discussion at this point.
Nikki, I'll read the questions, and then if you want to just answer them, we can just do it that way.
Sounds great.
One of the questions is, how is affordable being defined? Are these units rentals or purchase? If they are rentals, how do you ensure increased property taxes aren't being passed on to tenants, defeating the purpose of subsidization?
Absolutely. Yeah, those are great questions. So when we look at affordable housing, what we mean is that it's affordable in the sense that it doesn't cost more than 30% of a person's income toward their housing costs. So 30% is the number that is used by the federal government, and they kind of pass it on down along to all the rest of us. That's the line that of what's considered affordable. What the city is seeing in our housing needs analysis is that a high level of the need for affordable housing is in the rental market. And so this question around how do we make sure that rents stay affordable and aren't increased because, as you mentioned, of property taxes, or just because the market's getting hot, right? And folks know that they can increase rents, and there are people out there who'd be willing to pay them. So there's a few ways to go about this. One is with deed restricted housing. So where a deed is, there's a deed restriction placed on the property that says the rents charged in this location will not exceed 30% of whatever the area median income that you're targeting is. And certainly that's something that the city is looking at doing at its properties. There, for example, one of the things we're doing is there's a property at Franklin and Orchard where we are planning to break ground on affordable units this month. And how that is being done is that the city will maintain ownership of the land and has a long-term ground lease with the housing developer. And it's a 50-year lease, and the terms of that lease are that the housing that's built there needs to be affordable at no more than 30% of the AMI range that's being targeted. So there needs to be that. There definitely need to be things put in place to make sure that the rents are kept at that affordable level. And in general, with affordable housing, it depends on the type of housing, how long the affordability period is. There are some that have shorter affordability periods of 12 years or 15 years. And there are certainly some, like with our city ground lease that I mentioned, that 50 years is what we're looking at. And, with the intention that the city could then renew the lease and keep that housing affordable sort of in perpetuity.
Great, thank you, Nikki. There's another question from Gary that says, are the goals based on anticipated federal funding? What if the state capitalizes its housing trust fund? What if the Build Back Better bill is approved at 327 billion versus 100 billion?
Yeah, so great questions. Yes, we definitely, as we were setting these goals, factored in what we hope to see in terms of federal and state funding. I would say that these goals they're aggressive and maybe optimistic, but we see such a need that even if we met these goals, it's not going to meet the level of need that's out there in the community, right? This is what we think if the city works really hard and pushes itself on, that we could potentially achieve, but that's not going to solve the problem big picture. We're going to need a lot more in terms of members of our community, coming to the table to say, how can we work on this together? Certainly, I'm so glad you mentioned the state trust fund. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the state of Idaho is one of only a few states in the country that doesn't have a funded housing trust fund. That's basically a pot of money that the state legislature can dedicate toward affordable housing development. And we're really hopeful, optimistic, maybe it's a little naive, but we're certainly hopeful this year to see some of the state dollars go into that housing trust fund so that we can have more resources out there. And certainly the federal resources are a big part of the landscape that we're looking at.
Great. And Nikki, can you clarify, are the units needed only new units as yet non-existing, or do they exist and fall into that preservation bucket?
Yeah, so the goals that I mentioned before, and sorry, that is a great question. And the units needed on this chart, these are focused on new units. So it does not speak to the need to address the units that we're losing, right? The way that this is often described as it's like a leaky bucket, that the units needed here are assuming that we're pouring them into a bucket that doesn't have any holes in it, when all of us know the reality is that there are holes in the bucket and we're losing these affordable units along the way. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Great, just a few more here. Are there programs where a housing investor could get assistance in helping to produce housing from lower cost in order to charge lower rents, but still have a marginally profitable investment base?
Yeah, great question. So one tool that we have to try to make that possible, it's called the Housing Bonus Ordinance. It went into effect at the beginning of 2021. And essentially what it says is that if a developer is willing to have a certain number of the units in their new building be affordable, and by affordable we mean held at that certain rent rate for a certain number of years, right? Spelled out very clearly. That if they're willing to do that, then they can have increased density on the site. They could have, they can build an extra story over what the zoning code would usually allow. Sometimes there could be parking reductions included, with which parking is a very expensive part of housing development. So there are some levers there that existing ordinance is, essentially trying to provide. Here are some things that could make this less costly for a private market rate developer to be able to include affordable units in the building. There are other things that the city is exploring. For example, the question of waiving impact fees is something we have the ability to do under state law for affordable housing. And so thinking through in what circumstances that would be something that makes sense is another lever we could pull on that market rate developer side. I will also just quickly say, and sorry, my answers are super long, Lana. You're going to have to feel free to cut me off. I will quickly say that one idea that I often hear suggested from the community members is, what if we had some kind of requirement that if you are developing housing, you must include a certain number of affordable units in the new development. That's certainly something that other cities and communities have tried. Sometimes that's been at times very successful in producing more units. The challenge here is that that is something that was tried in both McCall and Sun Valley in the last 20 years or so. And both of those ordinances, they were taken to court over, and the ordinances were overturned by district courts. That essentially the court ruling basically said that that this was a tax, and that only the state legislature has the ability to have that kind of tax. So it's something that the city of Boise, in terms of our legal authority to do it, there would be some pretty big question marks around whether that would be something that we'd be able to move forward on.
Great, thank you. Are there any, oh, sorry. There was a question about, are there any programs to help first-time homebuyers?
Yes, so the city of Boise does have a program to help first-time homebuyers. There should be information about that on our website. And then this at the state level, the Idaho Housing and Finance Association also has those types of programs.
Great, and there's some questions in the chat that I'll just address for everybody about where we can find more information on the programs that you're mentioning, Nikki. I will drop a link in right after this. So a couple of more questions here. Diana's asking, it looks like we need a lot of units in the 60% or below. Lots of developers are tearing down some of our affordable housing. How are you ensuring that the property being developed has these low affordable units put back in?
Yeah, so that's absolutely a big concern. And in terms of how we are ensuring it, I would say currently we're not, right? That's something that if you are a property owner and you purchase the property, then under our current system, you have the right to charge the rent that you want to charge there. I think the question that I think is in there around what could we be doing to potentially say we need to have affordable units preserved is definitely one that there's a lot of interest in. Again, from a legal perspective, we have to be very mindful of the legal context that we're in terms of requiring that the rents be held at a certain level, but there are certainly things we could be considering around that preservation piece, because absolutely that is a huge, huge concern.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. These are very, so you mentioned rent controls. In a market where home values aren't rising and property taxes aren't rising as a byproduct, that makes sense. Where those increased taxes are being carried by the developers and they aren't able to reap the benefit of increased property values? How do you ensure they aren't losing money, which would remove incentive to participate?
I'm not sure I completely follow the question. I think what I'm hearing is a concern around, okay, if I'm a landlord and I agree that I'm going to hold my rents at an affordable level, so the rents are staying the same, but my property taxes keep going up and up and up, then, at some point this doesn't make financial sense for me anymore. I hope that I'm understanding the question correctly. So
yes, just confirmed.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that reality is a huge part of what's resulting in, landlords who understand like that there is this larger crisis, who want to, help their tenants stay in place, who want to keep good tenants, but at the same time are faced with their own property bills and are going, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I think that's absolutely a part of what's happening here. So property tax reform is certainly something we'll be watching the state legislature for with a lot of interest. So we'll see on that whether there will be any movement towards solutions on that end. But yeah, I think that is certainly a big part of the problem. And as we've been looking at ways, so we've been exploring this question of what are the ways that we could potentially incentivize private developers to participate, in agreeing to hold their rents at a certain level. And that is, the very initial response that we've gotten back from a lot of folks is basically, I just don't know whether I could make that make sense, right? And so I think this is where that subsidy question really comes in, is what is the smartest way for a city government to spend its resources in terms of ensuring that there are affordable units? And I think that there are a lot of question marks around that. And I think we have a lot of thoughts. So, I mean, going back to the example I gave before with the property at Franklin and Orchard that we are looking to break ground on this month, or the developer is. The part of what made that project make financial sense for the developer is that the city is establishing this ground lease at, a very, very low rate, where the developer is essentially not having to pay for the land. And in exchange, they are agreeing to hold the rents at that certain rate. So the city's able to come to the table with the land, the developer is able to come to the table with the building capacity, and we're able to work together in order to create a situation where it is financially possible to make this work. But when it comes to subsidy, I mean, there are usually, with affordable housing developments, you're looking at additional sources of subsidy, like from the federal government in the form of low-income housing tax credits, right? So that's another source that's out there to help make this, make projects financially feasible, make them pencil. Those kinds of tax credits are something that a lot of developers, particularly market rate developers, don't have a lot of experience in. How do I access this? Like, what's the process? What are my reporting requirements? So in terms of for what would incentivize a market rate developer to hold their rents at that lower level, I think that does become trickier because they don't have necessarily access to the same federal subsidy that's out there.
Great, thank you. And just in the interest of time, I will just reiterate that we're going to capture all of these questions and recommendations. There's some coming through about how we can, are there ways to look at property tax through, that could help incentivize to slow the rent increase. So we'll capture all of those. And so let's see, maybe let's move forward, because I think you're also going to dive into some of the tools that we're working on and kind of what we're looking at, what we're looking at in the next few months. So maybe let's go there, and then there'll be more time for a discussion as well.
Sounds great. So Tristan, if you wouldn't mind clicking through to thanks. Okay, so one thing that we wanted to make sure to kind of touch on here is that even with the income ranges that we gave before, sometimes it can be, we've heard folks say that it can be helpful to put certain occupations or income streams here just to help kind of really get a sense for what we're talking about. So very low income, when we're looking at that 30% AMI and below level, that might be somebody who is receiving their income through Social Security or disability or through part-time employment. Next slide. In the 30 to 60% AMI, we're often seeing childcare workers, cashiers, waiters, waitresses are frequently falling within that range. The next slide. And in that 80%, that 60 to 80% range, that's where you're going to find your social workers, your licensed nurse practitioners, elementary school guidance counselors. And I think we really wanted to include this piece just as a reminder for all of us around, these are the folks in our community who make our community work, right? Like, this is the fabric of our community. Our childcare workers, our social workers, our folks who we rely on in so many ways. And when we see so much displacement of folks who are the ones who make our community work, it's especially, it's so troubling. So that's kind of what we, I think, wanted to illustrate with these. You can go ahead, Tristan. Oh, and then there's a few more, apologies, in that middle income range. as well. And that's in the 80 to 120% of median income. You can go ahead. Okay. Tristan, would you mind just clicking ahead one more? Okay, so I would leave it up to you, Lana, whether, does it sound good to have a little bit more discussion there, or would you like me to go into this next session and then we can devote the rest of the time for discussion?
Let's do that, because I think we've
Okay.
spent a little bit of time on the discussion. Let's get through these, and I think this is where like the meat of the work
Yeah.
is, and I would love to hear feedback, thoughts, and reactions to this.
Absolutely. So a few efforts that are in progress. So emergency rental assistance, this is money that's coming from the federal government that's gone to the state, and specifically Boise and Ada County. So we, through the housing authorities, have provided almost $8 million in rental assistance to over 1,300 households. The city of Boise, I think, has expended, I want to say it's around 95% of the money that was allocated to us in this first round. And a second round of funding is going to soon be available. The city's also funded additional case managers for housing services providers. And we are working with to build additional permanent supportive housing. So that's additional units next door to New Path. And then we're also looking at the land next to Fire Station 5. If folks know, it's Fire Station 5 is the one right across from Rhodes Park. And that station needs to be redeveloped and updated. So part of what we're looking to do as part of that is to include affordable housing on that site, and specifically permanent supportive housing that would be dedicated to folks who are currently experiencing homelessness. Next slide. Okay. Someone mentioned the federal funds earlier, and that is a huge part of the discussion. So the American Rescue Plan funds that are coming to the city of Boise, we know that we have been allocated $36 million in what are called ARPA funds, and are looking at how we can allocate these in a way that will meet the needs of folks who've been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Housing is absolutely a huge part of the conversation, and a question around how much of that $36 million would go toward housing and exactly what it would go for is something that we are working on now, and also will be seeking a lot of input on from the community. We've also been doing some community leader outreach and meeting with, our local philanthropy, our local business leaders. And I will say we've had a lot of interest from members of our community who are coming forward and saying, I see that this is a problem. This is impacting so many aspects of our lives here. How can we be part of the solution? And then, not to just keep going on this piece around the city-owned land, that I mentioned the site at Franklin and Orchard. We also recently approved development of a second site at State and Arthur. If folks know the old Smokey Davis building, that's what that is. The city purchased that piece of land and is going through that same process where we will continue to own the land, but we'll have that long-term ground lease to develop it for affordable housing. And we're looking at a couple of other sites to do that as well. I mentioned Fire Station 5. Another one is Capitol Campus. That's a large piece of property that the city owns right across from BSU that is already rental housing and could be redeveloped to be additional units. So really looking at city-owned parcels that make sense for the potential development of affordable housing. And I think, is there another slide here, Tristan? Okay, what's next? So we already mentioned that we're doing community discussions. Feel free to check the calendar if you want to come to another one. We're also looking at piloting an accessory dwelling unit program that would look to try to incentivize homeowners who want to put an ADU in on their property. An accessory dwelling unit is just an additional unit on the property. You often see them above a garage, or they might be a mother-in-law suite, right? Something along those lines. So looking at, is there a way to incentivize folks to do that? And we are also inventorying the tools that we already have. So I mentioned the housing bonus ordinance as one, looking at other kinds of incentives that could be offered. And then we do have the zoning code rewrite, which is related to housing, in that it's an update of our zoning code. It's the first time we've updated the zoning code in, I think, 55 years. And so this question around what kinds of housing choice will our zoning code allow for is certainly one that we will be looking at. Okay.
Great, thank you, Nikki.
Yeah.
And to the folks who are in the chat, we can just open it up for discussion now. And if folks feel comfortable, we can do the video feature so we can see you and have a more robust discussion that way. And it looks like there's already one question in here. Monica is asking, what monthly rent is considered affordable for the groups we're focused on?
Sure. So 30% of area median income, or excuse me, 30% of a person's income is what's considered affordable. So I can actually pull up the city has specifically what that means in terms of rents. So for a 3-person household, at 60% of area median income, that would be a monthly affordable rent of $1,017. If folks have if folks want to take a look at this for information at other income levels, I can put it in the chat here. Oh, Lana, you're on mute.
Thank you. I thought I hit unmute, but I didn't. Thank you for that. How does the city plan to fund affordable housing units? Existing taxpayers are already being negatively impacted with property tax increases occurring the past few years. If this property taxation trend continues and is further burdened by another tax type to fund affordable rental housing, who don't pay property taxes? I'm concerned. So there's like, the question is essentially, how are we going to be funding affordable housing?
For sure. So the city is not looking at, we don't have a way to increase property tax. Like, that's not a mechanism that we would use to fund affordable housing. So some of it will be looking at, we're basically getting $36 million from the federal government, right? So how do we spend that $36 million? That's one funding source. There are additional funding sources. I think folks mentioned the infrastructure bill before. We are going to be looking really closely at how do we make sure that we're accessing whatever federal funds we might qualify for in order to address it. And then in terms of the housing land trust program that I mentioned before, one of the things that we're finding, right, is that if the city can come to the table with land that it already owns, that contribution can be a big piece in terms of making a project pencil. I think to your point that it is, I mean, we're seeing homeowners here who have owned their homes for many years and are at risk of being displaced because of their property taxes. And that's absolutely a housing affordability issue. So certainly very sensitive to the idea of, we don't want to place a further burden on people who are already being impacted by these high property taxes in the name of housing affordability. Like, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. So looking at, like I said, other kinds of resources, whether it's from through the federal government or looking at our existing land holdings, are certainly one area that we're very focused on.
Great, thank you. Justin has a question specifically around out-of-state investors buying local homes for Airbnbs, and noting that has risen over the last few years. Does the city have any plans to address the issue of investor buy-ups? And if so, do we have any restrictions, ideas we'd like to roll out or stem the rapid uptick in values?
Yeah, so speaking specifically to short-term rentals, the city doesn't currently have any kinds of restrictions on short-term rentals at all. We also don't collect information about short-term rentals. That's something that there's, currently conversation happening around whether the city could have some kind of registration program. That's something council will be deliberating on in the coming months. But even with the registration program, right, that's not going to stop anyone from coming and purchasing property and turning it into a short-term rental. It would just require them to tell us if that's what they're doing, which is certainly, that's a step toward more information is, certainly something that could potentially be helpful. But thinking through, the answer to your question, Idaho is a state with extremely strong private property rights. And so when it comes to a person's right, when they purchase a piece of land to do what they want with it, the law here tends to be on their side. And so really thinking about, okay, what kinds of incentives can we provide? How can we as a community rally around, for example, what if we create some kind of preservation fund? Because what you're describing, it happens very frequently here where you have an out-of-state investor who comes in with a lot of cash and they can purchase a property in all cash above asking. And maybe there was, a local developer who, or a local property owner, property management company that would have liked to purchase it and would have retained those rents at an affordable level, but they just got, they couldn't put together the financing fast enough. And so one thing that other communities have done is create a preservation fund that city governments, as well as local philanthropy and our corporate partners could all kind of jointly contribute to, that then would be a source of financing for folks who want to be able to purchase properties and again, hold them at that affordable level. So looking at some private-public partnership options like that is definitely something that we are very interested in exploring to see whether something like that could make sense here.
Great, thank you. And just being mindful of our time, we'll go to a couple more questions. Are there any programs where we encourage those needing assistance to be part of the solution of building more affordable housing as a way to help them get some sweat equity into building their affordable housing for rent reductions and or future dividends from real estate partnership as an investor?
So that's something that I know Habitat for Humanity does with their projects. That's not something that the city has done in the past.
Okay. I'm just tracking, that was one of the last questions I saw. There's some good points in here that again, we'll capture in our notes and reporting. So if you have any additional questions, we can hang on for just a few more minutes here. Feel free to pop them into the chat. And if not, we can wrap up. Some of you have messaged asking for the slides. We can definitely share those. A recording of this will be available on the city's YouTube page. So if you want to go back and listen to it or look through the chat or share it out, that'll be available that way as well. So I'll just leave it just for maybe a couple more minutes. Oh, there's a question. Jamie's asking, I'm curious if there's a way to multiply. Oh, sorry, they're all coming in at once now. If there's a way to multiply the available money by helping bootstrap some housing co-ops, that in turn can help bootstrap more housing co-ops. Let me know if you want me to reread that. Yeah,
I'm not totally sure. I'd be interested to hear more from this person about what they mean. I'm not totally sure that I'm familiar with the process they're talking about.
Jamie, do you want to clarify that in the chat? And maybe while you're doing that, we'll pop to one more. Somebody's asking, how about engaging employers in producing housing, employer-assisted housing? Is that an option?
Yeah, so that's certainly something. I was just reading today about St. Luke's is doing that up in, I want to say it's Ketchum, that they're developing some units that are specifically for their employees. So that is something that I think some of our larger employers are considering. Particularly the in the healthcare sphere where there's such a high need for staffing. So it's certainly, that is something that there's active discussion around.
Perfect. And we are right on the dot of 1:45. So let's see. Let's get to this one because I think it addresses some of the rental housing that we've touched on a little bit, and then we can wrap up with it. Are there any programs that will provide incentives for landlords to keep rents below market?
Let me think about how to answer this question. So how to incentivize, and I want to make sure I'm understanding, how to incentivize landlords who are currently renting out their units and they're keeping their rents below market just because that's the choice that they're making about the property they own, not because they're already required to. Am I getting that right?
Yes, I think essentially, are there any programs to help landlords who are already providing rents at a low cost below market to help them stay that way?
Yeah, so that's certainly something that different areas are trying different things around. One thing that the city could consider doing on this front is essentially a revolving loan fund that would help with repairs and renovations for landlords who are willing to agree that sure, I've been charging below market rate rents, or I've been charging rents at this affordable level. And if I'm, willing to agree that I will keep the rent at that affordable level, then I can access a very low interest or no interest loan to take care of repairs that might be needed. The city has had a similar program to that in the past, and it's something that we could certainly consider exploring. I think one of the challenges with it is comes with one of the first questions that was asked around, if I'm a private market landlord and I'm agreeing, okay, I'm signing this thing saying I'm not going to raise rents for X number of years, then what happens if, my roof caves in and suddenly I can't raise rents to raise the revenue that I would need to fix the roof, right? These very real concerns that folks have around committing to long-term affordability. And so figuring a path through that in a way that makes sense and for that property owner, and makes it so that they're going to be able to continue to operate and in the long term, and also to protect those units as being affordable to the folks who are living there. That's certainly something that there's a lot of interest around, but yeah, kind of a tricky one.
All right, thank you everyone for joining. We look forward to continued discussions. This has been great. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, it'll be available on YouTube. We'll be doing more outreach and neighborhood discussions. They're kind of 3 parts of this first round of 3. This is the second one that's virtual. We're going to have another one at the library at Hillcrest next week. I think we're in the next couple of weeks to talk about just kind of where we are and hearing from community members. The next set of 3 will be focused on more deeply diving into some of the tools that Nikki has shared, where we're investing time and effort, and what are we looking to forward in terms of tools we're going to look to explore further, either on our own or with partners. And then the last set will really be workshopping together with the community on some more innovative solutions to ensure that we can keep housing affordable for anybody that chooses to call Boise home. So thank you all for joining, and look forward to more discussions with all of you. Have a great afternoon.